Thank you again for coming today, and it's my pleasure to start the second half of our program. My name is Jim Schoff. I'm a senior associate here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I was supposed to be just a panelist, and unfortunately I will be filling in the role of moderator as well. Do-Young Kim here at Carnegie could not participate due to medical reasons, but so I will stand in and be an active moderator / participant in the process. We have a great opportunity to dive in a little deeper to some of the issues that Assemblyman Park started us off thinking about, and we get a chance to do it with three wonderful gentlemen with whom I've often had discussions about these issues individually, and now I get a chance to do it all at once, as if we're hanging out in my living room here. So just to briefly introduce our guests, you probably know them all, but Chung-min Lee, to my right, professor at Yonsei University, and who is now the ambassador, also appointed as ambassador for national security affairs from Korea, and is a longtime friend. We've had the pleasure of working together, both when I was at the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. He's worked at think tanks in RAND. He's taught in the Lee Kuan Yew School, the National University of Singapore. He's wonderfully positioned to talk about regional dynamics and on these issues. To his right, Kang, who is Vice President of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies and the Director of their Center for Foreign Policy. Also a longtime friend and another talented scholar who also has practical policy experience, having worked at the Blue House before as well. And we also have Choi Stangarone, my apologies, here at the Korea Economic Institute. He's been there since 2005. He is their Senior Director of Congressional Affairs. Very knowledgeable on Korea policy and gives us the U.S. perspective and the congressional perspective as well, which I want to touch on a little bit. He also previously worked for Senator Torricelli on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. So to begin our conversation, we'll talk, we'll go for about a half hour, I think, and then we'll have a chance to open it up more broadly to your questions as well. I want to set the scene just a little bit, building on our initial comments. We have seen, Doug Paul brought up the comment that just recently we've had threats from North Korea that he's going to nuke Washington and other cities if we continue to undermine North Korea's sovereignty and security. We've had missile tests. We've had a variety of rhetoric continue and signs that North Korea is not particularly interested in international engagement or talking to us on the terms that we're interested in. But at the same time, there has been some progress. We still don't know how far it will go between North and South, talking about possible participation of the North in the Asian Games coming up. There's aid from South Korean NGOs is starting to flow to the North, and I think the Eugene Bell Foundation also just had some aid approved by the government in Seoul. So there's some breakthrough there. We talked about Rajin Port and some of the progress with Russia and the development of the special economic zones, and talks that North Korea has been having with Japan on the abductee issue and trying to remedy some of the rupture in their relations. So we have this, as we often do with North Korea, this kind of muddled picture and very at a very dynamic time of regional politics and regional foreign policy, not only vis-a-vis North Korea, but on a variety of other issues in the region. So I'd like to start out a little bit about the Korean view, the South Korean view of North Korea policy. The by-elections are coming up at the end of this month, and some are suggesting that with that out of the way, we maybe have an opportunity for the Pak government to re-engage more meaningfully with the North, if indeed they are interested in that and anything productive. Chung-min, I wondered if you could start a little bit on how you see things now vis-a-vis North Korea specifically, and then we'll open it up more widely.
Well, Jim, it's great to be back here in Washington, and especially at Carnegie. I see so many old friends. I saw a guy in Seoul about 2-3 weeks ago. Jim Pearson, I've known for 25 years plus. Tells you how young I am. Alex, my dear friend from the UN. Buckloads of friends all over the room. So it's great to be here in the audience, and especially with my good friend Choi and Kang. On North Korea, it's been 1.5 years since President Park came into office, and I think she has found it extremely difficult to move forward. It's not her fault, it's just that the nature of the beast is such that Kim Jong-un has been in office now in power for 2 years plus. And from what we understand, despite the fact that there has been a very rapid turnover of senior KPA leadership, as you know, ever since Kim Jong-un came into the fold, his grasp on power seems to be fairly robust. So despite some speculations in the press and outside that the North Korean regime may be unstable, they may be in for a sudden collapse or whatever, I think the consensus within the government is that the Pyongyang regime, despite its ups and downs, at least at a structural point of view, remains fairly robust. So that means that throughout, I would argue, the remaining years, the remaining 3.5 years of the Park administration, chances are highly likely they will be dealing with Kim Jong-un and his co-groups of supporters within the party and the armed forces. The second major issue, however, is that despite the fact that North Korea on the outside may look more stable, and they are toying with, pockets of economic reform, what we're most concerned about is that after the 2006, 2009, and 2013 nuclear tests, they might go for a fourth nuclear test. We have no indication that they're doing it at this particular time. But if they cross that threshold, we're going into a new twilight zone, in the sense that despite all the great efforts of Tom and many others in this government and in Korea, unfortunately, we have all basically been unable to prevent North Korea from having nuclear weapons. And so despite the great progress North Korea has in X number of nuclear devices, as Dr. Jin Park alluded to, we don't really know exactly how many they have in the basement, but they have done 3 nuclear tests. And what we're most concerned about, together with our American friends, is the potential for the miniaturization of nuclear warheads. As you know, North Korea has a huge range of ballistic missiles, so their delivery capabilities covers all of Korea, Japan, and of course outside, and even perhaps continental United States. So those are all key issues that we are concerned about. So that leaves us to the third question, which is, okay, if North Korea is not going to move on the nuclear issue, then what other incentives, what other avenues, including the 6-party talks, can we use? And I think in that sense, the role of China remains absolutely crucial. And if you look at what the Chinese have done over the last 10, 15 years, they have inched closer to the prevailing view, which is a North Korea with nuclear weapons is not a strategic asset. Now, there might be some people who would argue in Seoul or Beijing or other places that a North Korea that is fundamentally a threat to the region is an asset because it is a buffer against Japan and South Korea and the US. But if you look at the biggest change, I think, from South Korea's perspective, Jim, it's this. The power ratio between China and North Korea over the last 20 years has skyrocketed. So that North Korea, in many respects, has remained very dormant. It's got even more threatening, whereas China has changed fundamentally. So that from the Chinese perspective, even though it may take the leadership a long time to move their actual North Korea policy, they're realizing that the manifest importance of North Korea to China has become smaller and smaller. So in that sense, I believe that, especially after the Park-Xi summit, the follow-on visits we hope will occur, we are very hopeful that the Chinese really must now speak to the North Koreans. It must be the moment of truth. If you allow North Korea to go down the path of more nuclear weapons, with even more advanced and accurate delivery systems, with the potential for nuclearized, miniaturized warheads, that will be basically an existential threat, which none of us really want. And I think that message must be sent to the Chinese leadership very, very clearly. On the election, I am not a political analyst, I will not divine how many seats the government will win or lose. But as in all democracies, this is going to be the single most important election for the ruling party this year. And then in 2015, thank God there's no election in South Korea. And in 2016, in April, we have very important parliamentary elections. So this will be a major watershed for the Park government. But as I said, we have elections on July 30th, and I hope that things will work out okay for the government. But nobody really knows because it is entirely up to the men and women of South Korea.
Right. No, thank you. Kang, can I ask you, picking up on the Xi-Pak summit and your impressions of how that went, and does that offer Seoul some additional leverage, as Chung-min was kind of hinting at in that regard?
Let's say, let me quote some of the public poll data. Actually, after the summit, Asan conducted a public poll. Actually, most people began to see China as a kind of concern. 68% see China as an economic concern. Almost equal number actually answered China as a security concern. And also, majority of people actually subscribe themselves to the security cooperation with the United States is the most important thing we have to do. And also, actually people, including myself, are a little bit disappointed with the outcome of this summit, because actually we're actually looking for some kinds of, actually what Jin-Bak mentioned, like a denuclearization of North Korea, but actually we came out with against the nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. That can mean various things. One, denuclearization of North Korea, or the withdrawal of the U.S. extended nuclear umbrella vis-a-vis South Korea, all these kinds of things. But we are very much puzzled, because actually before the summit, Chinese scholars or government officials underscored Xi's visit to Seoul prior to his visit to Pyongyang. This is unprecedented one. Now, Xi came to Seoul only, didn't go to Tokyo, but I wonder how could Xi come to Tokyo or come to Pyongyang under these circumstances. Actually, Chinese scholars actually underscore the significance of this visit. Actually, that's why actually people expect some different position of China on North Korean issue, but we didn't get it. China actually maintained the same stance as it did. And also, we did expect the other issue, like Chinese support for the unification bonanza issue, but unfortunately, we didn't get it. But what was the outcome? Of course, we set the date for the FTA with China, and also China offered the AIIB. So actually, gave more challenges rather than the solutions. We are very much puzzled about it. So the Xi's visit actually made South Korean people to revisit China question very much. And also we actually, as Chung-min and also Jin-Bak mentioned, have some kinds of positive role to be played by China, but our expectation actually has come down a little bit low. So that's why we are emphasizing the role of China nowadays in denuclearizing North Korea. And also, but it seems that China still underscores the utmost importance on the maintaining the peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. That means the continuation of the current North Korean leadership. It seems to me that they are preoccupied with the kinds of imaginative collateral damage that can happen if the North Korean regime collapsed. That's the first one. Second, maybe if there's a regime collapse in North Korea, that could be the lead to the restructuring of regional architecture, maybe benefiting the United States, mostly not China. So they began to see, it seems to the Chinese began to see North Korea problem rather than from bigger picture between U.S.-China relations. That's a challenge. So game actually has changed from North Korean nuclear issue, then became North Korea problem, that now is becoming U.S.-China issue. So that's a challenge ahead of us for South Korea to solve and to meet these kinds of things. But actually, unlike other people, I like to underscore the role of the United States very much. It's not China, it's the United States. North Korea wants to have a dialogue. So U.S. position and approach toward North Korea is the most important thing. Of course, China is the main provider of energy and food, and also main importer of North Korean natural resources. Also, the North Korea actually earns a hard currency by selling their mineral resources to China. But if they want to come back to the international community, the actual key is in the hand of the United States. So while we are emphasizing China's role in preventing the further deterioration of the situation, but actually the key is in the hand of the United States to change the game, the course of event in the coming days. About this local election issue, actually, I mentioned, actually Chung-min is quite awkward position to say something about it.
No.
I can say something on that. Actually, there's nothing to do about this, the security issues in the local election. There are 15 seats. My bet is about the ruling party will probably can get about 7 to 8 seats. That's not that bad at all. Because actually, not because of the ruling party is doing well, but because of the opposition party is doing very poorly in campaigning by nominating wrong people to wrong district. So actually, the ruling opposition party didn't get the public support very much. So that's why they went out to the street to stage a kinds of the demonstration against the government. But I think that's the kinds of losing game. So I think relatively after the July 30, the government will be in a better position to execute the policies President Park Geun-hye has been pursuing for the past 1.5 years. So I'm sure we will be in a better position to implement the policies, not only on the foreign affairs and national security, but also all the domestic issues will be dealt wholeheartedly.
Thank you. Well, you gave me a good segue emphasizing the important role that the United States plays. Troy, I want to talk to you a little bit about where the U.S. stands on this. They alluded in the earlier panel to the sanctions bill that the House is looking at that could really increase and tighten sanctions on North Korea. I'm not sure whether the Senate or the President would go along with that or not. But also looking from Washington at closer Korea-China relations, maybe fear about that is overblown, that somehow South Korea is defecting away from the U.S. alliance, and also Japan's outreach to North Korea. What's the mood in Washington on these issues going forward with North Korea? Do we see any change possibly in policy?
Well, I think it's difficult when you look at North Korea to see large-scale substantive change. I mean, we've talked already today about the fact that, we now have a good sense of not only what kind of control Kim Jong-un has on the regime in Pyongyang, but also sort of what type of leader he is. The Obama administration, even going back to its beginning, has made various attempts at trying to reach out to North Korea, and each time it's done so unsuccessfully. Be it either, early in the administration, when North Korea essentially has, some people actually like to say, gave a cold hand to Obama's outreach, or when you look now at the Leap Day Agreement, which lasted about 2 or 3 weeks right after Kim Jong-un came into power. And to, I think, the administration's credit, they did try to reach out to the new regime to see, if there was an opportunity to take and try and do something and set a new tone, and set a new stage. So I think when you look at a lot of people's perspective in Washington right now, there is a cynicism, I guess you could say, that North Korea is really willing to take and move forward, that they're willing to take and make the choices they need to make to take and address the nuclear issue, and to take and actually revive the economy and build a better future for their own people and for the Korean Peninsula itself. So I think there's a lot of cynicism when it comes to North Korea's ability to do that. And now if you look at the House perspective, in the sanctions bill, this is something that's been teed up, for a few months now. There was an expectation earlier this spring that we might see another nuclear test. A lot of this was in place for that. There is a lot of consideration that they look at the situation with Iran. There's this idea or conception that North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned state in the world, when there's many things that we have done towards Iran that we haven't done towards North Korea. Now the caveat to that is that there are other things that are much more sensitive in Iran's sanctions, such as its support on international, or its need for international trade, its oil trade, that you don't have with North Korea. And the North Korean situation becomes much more complex, and this is sort of what we've been talking about. As Kang said, the United States is sort of the key to this, but at the same time, China is that one country out there that is sort of the lifeline to North Korea. And the United States has to be able to get China on the same page with it to take and make this work. But if it can't, China always serves as that sort of lifeline area. And so the difficulty, I think, right now for the U.S. is, we've seen these rhetorical shifts in the Chinese perspective, but we haven't seen necessarily the commitment to take and sort of move into a more substantive direction on that. And some of that is because, as we've just mentioned, Kang was saying, if you look at this long term, what does unification mean? What would the consequences be perhaps for China? The price can be high. And so I think one of the challenges the administration faces is, how do you take and get everyone on the same page and lined up? And, that starts with having, close consultations and there being zero daylight between Seoul and Washington. Then, making sure you have the same with Tokyo, and then trying to find a way to bring Moscow and Beijing into that as well. But I think, going forward, there will be, if an opportunity were to present itself, I think the administration would probably explore it. But I don't think that there's many people in Washington who see that as coming anytime soon.
Yeah, the impression I get, or what I hear from friends, is there are some folks in Washington who are interested in exploring some types of limited engagement, but nobody wants to bring that idea up to the president right now because they've been burned before, and there's enough other priorities going on.
Not even just a question of having been burned before, but I mean, if you look at the broader context for the United States right now, we're trying to take and get this deal with Iran. You have, now the split up with Israel-Palestine. You have Syria ongoing. You have the Russia-Crimea situation. There's only so much bandwidth in Washington to deal with these issues. And so the question becomes, if North Korea were to, or if there were small-scale things you could do, does the administration have the time or the desire at the moment to do that without some real assurances that North Korea is going to take and move forward, given all the other things it has on its plate? Is that where it wants to put its political capital?
Right. I mean, I keep coming back to the idea that, as Doug mentioned as well, that Seoul is really the key right now in the near term, and it seems we're often usually highlighting some other country that's the key, whether it's the United States or China or Korea in this case. But given where the United States is right now, given the need, yes, North Korea wants to deal with the United States on the nuclear issue, but there's a whole host of other issues between North and South that could begin to provide some of this atmosphere for improvement. So what about the idea of, maybe you pass some kind of sanctions that you have waiting in the wings in case there's a fourth nuclear test? You use the nuclear test as the main, or some long-range missile test as the main criteria of, to the north of, are you serious or are you not? And absent that, Seoul has an opportunity to try to explore other types of engagement. Is that a reasonable way to go, Chung-min? And if so, how far will the politics allow Seoul to lean forward?
Well, Jim, as you know, ever since the Cheonan sinking in 2010 and the bombing of Yangpyeong Island in 2010, we've had a number of unilateral sanctions on North Korea called the Oisachochi, or the May 24th sanctions. And we felt very strongly at that time the Lee Myung-bak government put those sanctions in, which the Park government has continued to keep. And so the key question is, can you move forward on inter-Korean relations without removing the May 24th sanctions because of Cheonan? And the answer the president has said so far is, unless we hear officially from North Korea that such incidents and attacks and provocations will not take place again, and for the DPRK to assume official responsibility for those actions, she simply cannot say, well, everything's basically bygone and then we'll just move on as if nothing happened. But at the same time, she has also said, and this is the tricky part, we have to push a North Korea policy that goes beyond state-to-state relations. And I think the big difference between President Park Geun-hye's thinking and previous administrations is that she wants to really emphasize humanitarian assistance. And she has also said, we want to make sure that from now on, our North Korea policy is focused not only on the North Korean government, but on the North Korean people. And if you think about it, well, you might ask yourself, why is that important? I think it's very important because if you're a North Korean citizen today, wherever you're living in North Korea, and information is filtering in through, TV programs, surreptitiously, videos and so forth, and if they realize that the lion's share of the humanitarian aid that they receive is from South Korea, I think that will have a longer-term cushion once Korea gets unified. But for the president to say, I will lift sanctions tomorrow without any North Korean assurances, that's political suicide. So she will never do that. But she also cannot let the impasse go on forever. So this is why the Park government is, in some ways, caught between a rock and a hard place. But I think that's where the art of diplomacy and the possible political action comes in. So after we pass the midterm elections, so-called by-elections in the next couple of days, the president has put in place a second so-called officials to run the national security apparatus. I'm hoping that there will be consolidation of our policy options towards North Korea, and I'm hopeful that by the fall of this year, we may be moving forward on inter-Korean ties. At the same time, I'm also hoping that the North Koreans will be more receptive. If Kim Jong-un accepts responsibility for what happened in 2010, then yes, we'll move on. So it's basically reading between the lines, but I'm just hoping that by the end of this year, there will be some forward movement.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
I have a little bit different interpretation. Of course, it's possible for South Korea to lift up the May 21st sanction measures if there is apology coming from North Korea. That's one thing. But the other important thing is the UN Security Council sanction measures. Unless there is a North Korea's clear action to send of denuclearization, it's not possible for South Korea to go ahead. For example, of course, Jin Bang mentioned about this gas pipeline and railway connection and all those things. But I think there's a limit, clear limit for South Korea to push those two projects.
Kang, those two aren't related. All I'm saying is that the May 24th sanctions were placed specifically because of the Cheonan attack. All of our other UN sanctions, as Korea is a member of the UN, we are now a member of the UN Security Council for the next 2 years. So obviously there is every bit of responsibility on our part to make sure that we abide by all of the UN sanctions. But the May 24th sanctions, that's
separate one. And also that's why I'm saying that even though we lift up, there's still limit for South Korea to go. And also there's actually, Chung-min, you're quite right, a humanitarian front, there's actually the weakest point North Korea has. We have to exploit that area to think about this kind of social integration at a later phase and to earn the hearts and minds of North Korea as humanitarian. Also that's why Park Geun-hye government is very eager to provide humanitarian assistance to North Korea. And also Eugene Bell is one thing, but also we have been providing the powder milks or like that for the past 1.5 years. So humanitarian engagement is there. On the other, we have to think about the sanction measures, more intrusive sanction measures. If North Korea does not respond to our call for denuclearization or any kinds of apology for this, the provocation in 2010.
And just one quick other reason why humanitarian measures might be good is that, if you look at economic engagement more broadly, where the May 24th measures do come in and limit opportunities, is that one, South Korean firms cannot invest more in Kaesong, so you're sort of in a standstill there. And while both North Korea and South Korea push the idea of internationalizing Kaesong, I think it's going to be really difficult to get foreign firms to come in, and there's questions even with the sanctions in place if they can. And the one firm we have seen come in, the way they're getting around all of this is they're not actually using North Korean labor to reduce anything. They are going to be selling to the South Korean firms in Kaesong. So in some ways, they're now a service industry within Kaesong to the South Koreans rather than dealing with North Korea. So I think, you have these limits on what you can do.
Yeah. Well, and Japan runs into this issue as well in terms of its own sanctions versus those related to the UN. I think there's been some confusion on that, at least that I've seen a little bit in the press, because Japan is using its own sanctions on remittances and travel back and forth between North Korea and Japan as leverage in their dialogue on trying to resolve the abductee issue. It's interesting, North Korea right now is kind of playing the Japanese media like a fiddle in terms of letting out leaks and dribs and drabs of information, that raising expectations that somehow abductees are going to come back alive, or maybe they're just going to be the wives of North Koreans that had emigrated there years ago. We still don't know exactly how that's going to shake out, but the political pressure or perceived political opportunity by Abe to maybe make a trip to Pyongyang or some kind of big breakthrough is there, and is certainly a concern here. I think we can certainly trust the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan, and level heads understand that they really need to get a lot from North Korea before they would take such a step, but they're we don't know the inner circle around Abe in terms of how quickly they would go. Just briefly before I open it up to the rest of the group, would a visit by Abe to Pyongyang, is that can we somehow, let's say North Korea really does come through with something meaningful on abductees, and on the one hand, as long as they're not relinquishing or easing up on UN sanctions, and they're just playing with their own sanctions, and we have another diplomatic engagement avenue, maybe that could be utilized by the other parties, the United States and Korea, as a way to further thaw the situation, but inevitably some are going to view it as undermining efforts or undermining solidarity. And what are the risks and rewards of potentially of
Prime Minister Abe, both in his first term and now in his second term, has taken ownership of the abductee issue, and for him and for many Japanese, it is an extremely emotional issue, and he, for obvious political reasons, wants to make sure that that issue is settled, if it's possible, under his watch. So that's a political call on his part, and I think from the South Korean government's perspective, as long as North Korea's negotiations with Japan on the abductee issue is focused solely on the abductee issue and doesn't spill over negatively on other areas such as the nuclear front, then I think basically we can live with that. So the key issue is how much consultation is there between Japan and the U.S. and with South Korea on this particular front. I really do not know at this stage, but I think there has to be a comfort level between Tokyo and Washington and Seoul that this particular abductee issue, if it is whatever safety valve there is, if it satisfies those demands, then I think the three of us can move together on other fronts. But this is a political call that Mr. Abe has to make, and as much as he is involved in this particular issue, I would find it very difficult to believe that he is going to throw everything on the abductee issue, because obviously Japan, as a responsible member of the international community, has other issues with North Korea that she has to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just the one thing I would add is that, when you think about this, if North Korea were to follow through, and I think there's a lot of questions about whether they would actually follow through and meet what he would need, it raises the interesting situation, which I don't think any of us would have ever thought, that there could be a summit between Kim Jong-un and Abe before there's one between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping, which, you might want to think about that optimistically.
One other thing, Jim, and if you don't know what's happening in Japan, I don't know who knows in Washington, since you go to Japan quite often. And so you're being much too, polite in that sense. You're underestimating your own readings of what's happening in Japan. On the abductee issue, this is one other point that I'd like to share with the audience is this. For North Korea, if they use the abductee issue for political benefits or economic benefits, it's a one-time deal. You cannot go back to the Japanese over and over again and say, oh, this is our second best package or third best package, right? And the next threshold they have to cross is, if you do resolve the abductee issue, then you go down the pathway of normalization on other issues. So in other words, there will be mounting pressure on North Korea to move on other issues if they are able to resolve the abductee issue. And politically speaking, for Kim Jong-un, this is a tricky issue because the abductee issue happened under the watch of his grandfather and his father. So the good thing is they both passed away, so he can blame them for whatever happened in the past. But as I said, it carries a political, there is a political risk. Because if he says, oh, everything that happened in the bad past were done by my grandfather and my father, the very source of his legitimacy politically, that basically will have very different repercussions domestically. So I think for Kim Jong-un, although he can gain tactical gains at this time by playing off Japan ostensibly against the U.S. on this issue, there are far greater political pitfalls for him in the longer term.
Yeah. Kang, one quick question before I go out. Well, maybe two quick questions and then we'll open it up. But Russia. Dr. Pak talked a little bit, somewhat optimistically, on the potential for Russia to be a positive force in this engagement process and economic development in the north. What about the idea that Putin could be just say, here's an opportunity to really bog down the United States on another front, and if China wants to put pressure on you, don't worry, come to me. I will give you everything you need, political cover of the UN, et cetera, et cetera. Do you worry about a real spoiler role there, or do you think that's manageable?
Of course, there's a possibility always for Russia to play kind of spoiler role in this game, but I think that Russia's engagement to the Korean Peninsula is quite selective and opportunistic. If they don't see any kind of immediate harvest of the investment, they don't do any kinds of stupid things at all. Of course, they actually clear the debt, 90% of the debts of North Korea right now. But anyhow, they could not get it bad at all, so they actually cleared up. But all this, the Russian project is also continued upon this other parties' corresponding measures. So there's a quite limited role. But actually, on the other hand, Russia is preoccupied with the situation in the West Front, Crimea and Ukraine. A much more urgent problem, and also that's why I'm thinking that Russia's role is quite limited. And so even whether it's positive or negative, it's quite limited role to be played by Russia. But the only one thing that actually Dr. mentioned about the Eurasian initiative. That's why the South Korean government underscored the role of Russia. But on the nuclear dimension or North Korean dimension, I think there's a quite limited role for Russia to play.
Okay. And my last question for all three of you. Very quickly, if there's a fourth nuclear test, is that a fundamentally different event than it has been in the past? Is this crossing a point of no return, kind of really changing the game domestically, politically, or in terms of diplomatic strategy, or is it a serious thing that needs to be responded to but doesn't necessarily fundamentally change?
A friend of mine who is known to many of us in this room, Yamaguchi-san in Tokyo, once said that we have set so many red lines over the last 20 years on North Korea that it's turned into a red carpet. And I agree, maybe it's red or maroon or who knows what the color is these days. But a fourth nuclear test will be a wake-up call, because I think for the Chinese, look at it this way, Xi Jinping will be in office for another 8 more years. The last thing he wants in his administration, in his years in power, is to have the North Korean problem, become the frontal issue for him. And so for President Xi Jinping, there are deep political concerns that he wants to manage the North Korean portfolio as best as he can, and a fourth nuclear test will be the total opposite of what the Chinese desire. And I think it'd be a wake-up call for many of us in this room and outside, because if North Korea does a fourth nuclear test, all bets are off in terms of what other engagement efforts we can bring to bear. But let me just go back briefly to a potential Russian role. I don't think we should overestimate what Russia can do, but neither should we underestimate what Russia can do. She is, after all, member of the UN Security Council, permanent member of the six-party talks. Russia has strategic interests in Korea and beyond. And if you look at what they've done, especially after the gas deal with the Chinese, although the Russians are very close to the Chinese for political and economic purposes, over the longer term, I would argue that South Korea can be a very, very important partner for the Russians. The Russians have strategic interests over Japan. You have the Northern Territory issues. So although Russia doesn't have a huge presence in the Far East, she has had over the last 200 years critical strategic interests in the region. And I think if we are able to play a more constructive role vis-a-vis Russia, I think the Russian role in Korea, including the nuclear issue, will be more positive than before.
Okay. Yeah. About the first nuclear test, it depends on types of nuclear tests North Korea will stage. Whether it's going to uranium-based nuclear test or plutonium-based test. If it's just uranium-based, it's a really wake-up call. Yeah. And also the other element is just the nuclear test, but also how far North Korea advanced is reprocessing. I mean the enrichment capability. That's the key components. If they use the plutoniums for the first nuclear test, maybe they wasted the value of the asset. So we have to think about the uranium-based. I think that's still, of course, the foreign minister Yoon Byung-se mentioned is going to be a game changer, but depends on the types of nuclear tests North Korea will stage.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd say is I remember after the third nuclear test, there were discussions that maybe we'll just start becoming numb to these, that, used to North Korea does these. I think the reality is that, it may not be, a situation where we have a significant shift, but it starts making more clear that, this is something we have to address. This is a problem that's not going away. It's one that's becoming worse. And when you couple it with the issue of North Korea's missile development, it's one that becomes strategically dangerous. And so, we're further down that path where we have to find a way to solve this problem. So I don't think when people talk about the idea of, well, maybe people will just become numb to it, that that's factual. I'm not sure it's going to be a significant strategic shift, but I do think it creates greater awareness and greater, not incentive, but greater need to address the problem more quickly.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everyone for indulging me and allowing me to carry out this conversation. I'd like to give everyone...
You're very good as Tuyong.
Oh, maybe I have a future somewhere after all. So if you raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone to you, and please let us know who you are, where you represent, and you can address your short question either to the whole panel or to someone specifically there. So we'll begin here, this woman. And I'll take maybe 2 questions and then we'll go, and then there's a gentleman back there.
Hi, my name is Malika. I'm a recent policy graduate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm wondering, so it's for anybody, if you'd care to comment, your opinion about the role of kind of media and popular culture in terms of government interaction. I think we've seen Kim Jong-un interact much more actively in terms of shaping his popular image, and also reacting negatively to some recent viral videos and different movies. So if you have any opinions about the way that you think that might affect government relations.
Okay, so we have one there, and then there's a gentleman back there.
Hi, my name is Sam Yoon. I'm president of the Council of Korean Americans. My question is, I think firstly directed at Troy, but I'd invite others to comment, about HR 1771, about strengthening enforcement of sanctions. What I heard the other speakers from Korea talk about was that President Park has a very clear strategy that combines humanitarian assistance with sanctions as a way to win hearts and minds. But what I heard very clearly is that this kind of state-to-state diplomacy, President Park is recognizing is clearly limited. And so I'd love to hear you comment on kind of the strategy behind HR 1771, because it seems to me it carves out humanitarian work as kind of exception to the sanctions regime that it proposes, but very clearly it's really about the stick and not the carrot. And so what are the chances that U.S. policy will align with South Korea's policy in the way, because it seemed to me that would be an effective way to go. Thank you.
All right, shall we start with a concrete one first here, and then we'll jump to the media and pop culture.
So, on the House sanctions, you're right. I mean, this is the stick. I think the thing we need to keep in mind about U.S. foreign policy and everything is that, there are, we'll say, degradations of roles, meaning that, the administration takes and leads on foreign policy. The Senate has a very significant role, and then the House has another role as well. I remember shortly after the third nuclear test, there was a sanctions bill that went through that was proposed in the House, and it actually would have taken and eliminated humanitarian aid in prospect. So I think, what this is reflective of, and, this is something, when President Obama talks to, either leaders in the region or other things, is that, when you look at the perspective of, the House to a degree, and we have to keep in mind, the Senate, right now, when you look at the elections coming up, there's a lot of talk that it could switch. So you could see a switch in dynamic in the Senate as well, because we're likely to end up with a U.S. Senate that's probably 50-50, or one party with a 49-seat majority. But there's a lot of distrust and a lot of frustration and angst with North Korea, and there's a sense that we haven't done enough. And the House is basically trying to push the administration to do more. Now, I think Jim's right. I'm not sure that this bill would get through the Senate. Definitely not this Senate. And the President probably doesn't want to go this direction. But I mean, it does sort of back up this idea that, we as a democracy have this, challenge, which is that, we have a lot of people who have a stake in things and who can express their opinion. And, the House is saying this is something that you need to do more on.
Well, this brings me quickly this question of human rights as a more prominent issue in relations with the North. Is certainly because of the UN Human Rights Report, it's gained some further currency here in the United States. In Korea, is this a bigger issue? Does President Park have to navigate this as part of the engagement, or is it just not as, can she address it more through the long-term humanitarian side?
On the human rights issue, I mean, throughout the campaign and even when she entered office, she has maintained a very, I would argue, consistent policy, which is North Korea has very significant human rights problems. And if we don't address those problems head on, then the problem is, what will the international community do to help us on other issues vis-a-vis North Korea? So we've got to also share our concerns with the international community on North Korea's human rights issues. Now, the key issue in South Korea, Jim, as you know, is whether the National Assembly will be able to pass a so-called North Korea human rights bill. It's been held up over the last several years because of political differences between the ruling and opposition parties. And I think both sides are coming to some type of a consensus. And I think even the opposition party realizes that you simply cannot ignore the plight of North Korean human rights problems. This is no longer a left or right issue. It is an all-Korean issue. The only problem is, how far do you want to go in addressing this particular issue? And so at some point in time, the National Assembly, I hope, will be able to pass a human rights bill that is bipartisan in nature. And the key issue here is bipartisan. So whoever leads on the human rights issue should not abuse it for political purposes. It should be something that all Koreans, regardless of your political beliefs, will understand that as a universal value issue, this is something that all Koreans must share in.
And jumping from that to media and pop culture, who wants to look at that? Because it is an interesting dynamic. Kim Jong-un basically has overplayed the basketball issue. He has made splashes in the media with his amusement parks and so forth. But I think the real concern is, I think the media is a very powerful tool. And you know why? There are more than, 4 million cell phones in North Korea today? Three, depending on the count. And you can't make overseas phone calls, but you can send text messages and so forth. We've seen reports of North Korean smartphones that you can buy, not all, but those who can afford it. But I think if you look at the number of pirated CDs, videos of what's happening in South Korea, the fact that more and more North Koreans are listening to South Korean radio and TV broadcasts, that news is filtering in. So media is playing an impact, because the official North Korean media, for what it's worth, I don't think really gets much traction in North Korea today. And I think that's where the power of the media really comes in, because it reinforces worldviews that the state simply cannot force upon its people anymore. Yeah. So
I agree, actually, but it's a rather long-term effect on North Korean people, not immediate effect. So we have to think about more information infiltration in North Korean society. But that's the base. But actually, it's premature to see kinds of organized formation of the public opinion among themselves. Rather, you have to think about maybe decades or down the road. But actually, those Koreans love to see this Korean soap opera, and also they love to follow the songs. Yeah. Actually, and so this infiltration. That's a sensitive issue. Actually, those Koreans, whenever we have a kinds of government talks, those Koreans always demand a kind of stopping of the information infiltration and propaganda strategies. That's the point they actually raised. So I think that's the weakest point we have to utilize.
Well, and it's interesting. He seems almost more sensitive to that than in the past. So it raises the question of what opportunities there might be. But just to go to the concrete example of basketball diplomacy and everything, whatever potential was there was completely undermined by the absolute wrong representative. I mean, I remember back in Rodman's playing days, Jordan had come out of retirement. They had just won their 4th championship. They signed Rodman. And, the story I remember reading or watching was that, Michael Jordan basically pulled Dennis Rodman aside and said, listen, we've won 4 titles without you. If we don't win one this year, it'll be because of you. So I don't care what you do off the field. I mean, he knew the guy was, basically out of it. But, on the court, you have to take and perform and be professional. And, the reality is that, for whatever love the Kim family has of the Chicago Bulls, Rodman is probably the only one who would have dared touch that situation, and he was the perfectly wrong messenger.
I certainly got burned. The gentleman here, and then I'll go over here. Then we'll continue. We have a little time up until 5:15. I think we're going today.
Alex. Yeah.
Alexander Ilitchev, until last month's UN official dealing with this set of issues. It's a fascinating event. I'm so glad that I decided to come from New York on my own. It just proves that if you read most of the publications, listen to the experts' views, official pronouncements here and there, I mean, you cannot escape a question. Okay, everybody understands what's going on. Somehow, people seem to be in denial that something has to be done about it. I mean, all the sanctions talk, more pressure, and so on and so forth. I mean, it has been in use for so many years. Where we are now at the point where everybody seems to be sort of acquiesced to the idea that there is something nuclear in North Korea, and most probably will be more and more. Okay, if this is the case in point, and the main question that the people have, what is it that we're going to do after another nuclear test, then I think we're on the wrong path. I mean, people should ask themselves, why suddenly, after several months of harsh rhetoric and promises to detonate, new shape, and so on, suddenly Pyongyang is almost silent and mute on this issue? My personal explanation is that the Chinese, Beijing, has delivered. They have worked on Pyongyang. They have explained to them in whatever ways and means that they do it. It's not a public diplomacy mostly, we have to respect it, but the result is it's actually the one that should be welcomed by everybody. But it's not the end result. The question is how to use this window, because it's obvious to me, and I hope to others, that it cannot last forever. So that's why I'm so encouraged to hear from the previous panel and now from this panel that Seoul, which I strongly share and agree with the need. It's the time for South Korea's real leadership, because the issues are obviously present the most stakes for that country and the whole Korean nation. And that there are people in Seoul who are thinking what to do, what has to be done differently so that to achieve the results we're all looking for. So I really support it, I look forward, and my only question is how the rest of the world can help South Korea's leadership in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. And this gentleman here.
Greg Tilman, Arms Control Association. I have two related about the North Korean-Iranian relationship. One is, I wonder if the panel could characterize what is that relationship right now, and secondly, speculate about if the P5+1 got an agreement, with a satisfactory agreement with Iran by the end of November, how would the North Korean-Iranian relationship be changed?
Okay. So how can the world help?
Let me tackle the Iranian issue first. As we all know, the Iranian regime and the North Korean regime have been collaborating on WMD for the last 15 plus years. And in exchange for North Korea's ballistic missile capabilities, it has been alleged, for example, that the Iranians have been exchanging other information as well. And I think if you look at what the North Koreans have done, we are most concerned about two things. If you look at what the North Koreans did with the Pakistanis, then the key issue here is what have the Iranians learned? And the Iranians have learned that if you are able to pursue a clandestine weapons program right below the radar screen, there are precedents whereby they can get away with it, i.e., for example, North Korea. And I think the Iranian negotiations that are ongoing now, I may not be sure, but the November deadline may be passed for a number of reasons. This probably came as a bit of a shock to North Koreans, because despite all of the ups and downs between Iran and the West, and particularly with the US, the current regime in Tehran has agreed to negotiations. And I think this was a very important forward step. And so if the negotiations go well, and this is a big if, and if the Iranians are able to convince the world that they're able to come clean on this particular issue, there will be added diplomatic pressure on Pyongyang. Can you not, for example, follow the Iranian trail? that could or could not happen. But I think the big difference between Pyongyang's story and Tehran's story is that the nature of the regime in Tehran, as hardline as it may be, is very different from the regime in North Korea. And so I think there are limitations as to what we can learn or unlearn from the Iranian case. But I think the negotiations have shown the world that Iran at least is seeking a third exit, whereas North Korea simply, currently anyways, is still sticking to its more dogmatic views. And I think this is a surprise for North Koreans because they probably believe in their hearts that Iran will be more like them than not. And I think that also came as a bit of a surprise. Yeah.
On North Korean-Iranian nuclear relations, I think there are two actual conditions to be met. For example, there was a comprehensive sanction measures against Iran, so they suffered a lot. Second, actually there's a leadership change in Iran, actually, which has a huge impact upon Iran's position on this nuclear deal. But on North Korea, we don't have those two conditions yet. So now we are discussing the sanction measures, more comprehensive sanction measures, actually with the support of Chinese participation in the sanction measure. Of course, I don't know whether there's a leadership change in North Korea or not. We recently had one leadership change, so it takes long. That means it takes a long time to denuclearize North Korea. So that's why we are emphasizing the deterrent postures and all the preparedness, and then make North Korea to pay the price for having the nuclear program. So we have not make the North Korea to pay the price. The isolation is there, but actually it's a kind of self-made isolation, that actually partially. So we have to make them to pay the price on that. So that's why. And also the other, actually I have a concern with the Iranian nuclear deal, whether actually United or P5+1 would allow to Iran to possess a kind of low-level enrichment program. That would give a North Korea another leeway. So why the U.S. allows Iran to possess the enrichment program, why we don't we? That actually happened when we agreed to provide, for example, North Korea requested the light water reactor program again and again and again. So actually we postponed that proposal. So actually, not just on Iran, but as the United States should think about this impact of Iranian nuclear deal upon North Korean regime very much. So we have concern in that. So that's one. What the world support, how the world can support South Korean leadership, there's a various way. First of all, I think we welcome all kinds of diplomatic as well as political support for the South Korea's policy toward North Korea very much, and also especially pressing China on put China on the same page with us, not just simply on the same page, maybe same sentence, same line. Of course, it's almost impossible to put China on the same line, but actually on the same page, and also make the believe that actually this is good for China as well as good for other countries in the region.
Alex, briefly, I think on that note, because we have so many simultaneous crises in the Ukraine, in Syria, now, of course, between Israel and the Palestinians, it is very important for the world, especially the great powers and the major powers, to place political capital on the North Korean issue.
Exactly.
And so whether it's Russia or China or Great Britain or France or many of the other major partners, they have to realize that despite the flurry of crises that the world faces, and leaders only have so much time to focus on these issues, the North Korean issue is a critical issue for the region and the world. And so there must be a political commitment on the part of the major powers that despite all the distractions, as important as they are, we must continue to keep focus on North Korea. Yeah.
And from my perspective, I think it's also important for us to give not only Korea, the Republic of Korea, but also some of the other countries involved in this. We need to give each other a little bit of space to explore and to trust, which my mantra is always the issue of solidarity. I think we're always much more effective when we have solidarity vis-a-vis North Korea. That doesn't mean we have to be completely in lockstep. Everybody has to do what everybody else says. So if you give that bit of space, then that obviously then requires an intensified level of communication, interaction, consultation that goes along with that. But somehow we need a little bit of that flexibility, I think, if we're going to get anywhere.
Just along those lines, I mean, I think this goes back to what you originally asked me, which I think I failed to answer at the time, about the question of sort of how, the U.S. views sort of China and South Korea's connection and everything. I mean, to use sort of President Park's phrase, trust politique, there's a decent degree of mistrust between a lot of these players. And it's going to take time to work through that and build the trust amongst the parties that are going to need to have that space that you talk about. And so, right now, South Korea and China are trying to do that. The United States and China need to build that trust.
Right, and that's Japan, U.S. talking about, we have to figure out.
My observation over the years of the diplomatic activities, exchanges, actually, we have been focusing on one issue at a time. We didn't have a kind of vision or agreement to end the state on the Korean Peninsula at all. So maybe that's the time we have to think about what should be the end state on the Korean Peninsula and how we can achieve that. And then what kinds of problems, challenges are ahead of us, not just focusing on this nuclear front, but also the humanitarian issues and social integration problems. All these things you should actually put in a more structured way, geared toward the unification issue. But of course, the Presidential Committee for Unification Preparation will do its work from that regard. But South Korea should provide the world about its vision for the end state on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, just to sort of ask you then, I mean, I agree that we need to sort of broaden it out, but when you talk about the end state and unification, it raises the question of, does North Korea really desire unification? They may talk about it and everything, but I mean, ultimately, that means serious choices for leadership there and very potentially serious decisions for their personally in terms of what their future would be after unification. So I mean, as hard as the nuclear issue is, I mean, is unification almost like infinitely more difficult?
Of course, we have to clarify that we do not seek unification by force or do not seek unification by collapse. So there's gradual, peaceful unification. That's the state that we can offer to North Korea. Of course, we cannot. I don't know what would the North Korea response. They make North Korea to accept the reality, and that's why we need a international community support for our desire and plan for unification.
Take a couple more here. I have this gentleman here in the blue, and then I got Frank in the back. Yeah.
Yes, Glyn Ford from the European Institute for Asia Studies. Two questions. If Kim Jong-un is not mad, what is he doing allowing 3 million mobile phones, credit cards, taxis all over Pyongyang, the production of DVD players but no DVDs? What's the plot? And secondly, is there any role for Europe apart from as a cash cow in the solution of this problem?
Okay, we got Europe and crazy.
In the front, fourth row on the left.
All right, well, let me take two more questions then. I'll take here, and then we'll get Frank in the back.
Steve Winters, Washington-based researcher. I'd like to ask Ambassador Lee what the view from South Korea is about a possible contribution that Mongolia could make to resolving issues on the peninsula. As we know, the leader of Mongolia visited North Korea, and in the months following, there was the important initiative about the Japanese abductees. And I've heard from people close to the Mongolian government that they are interested in playing a role, like with the Six Power Talks. But despite the visits of Vice President Biden and Defense Secretary Hagel to Mongolia recently, I gather that the U.S. is rather cool to this interest in Mongolia. What's the view from South Korea?
Okay, and then Frank in the back.
Hi, Frank Januzzi with the Mansfield Foundation. Good to see all of my old friends. I just had a question. I got back from Seoul last month, and I think it's fair to say there was a lot of skepticism in Seoul about the Abe initiative. On the one hand, I think people recognize that the humanitarian front does not mean that the Abe administration is preparing to lift sanctions with respect to the nuclear program. But nonetheless, I think many people in Seoul felt they were caught a little bit flat-footed. And I think it's fair to say that many people in Washington felt the same way. My advice to them was, rather than worry so much about Abe being out front on the humanitarian issues, that South Korea and Washington should each pick a humanitarian issue that they care about and sort of complement the Abe initiative, and let's probe the North a bit and see whether there's any room on the humanitarian front while the nuclear talks are in abeyance. And I would like to hear from the panelists about whether or not they think there's any possibility of such humanitarian outreach to sort of bring the three allies back into closer alignment not by reining in Abe, but essentially by having Park Geun-hye and Obama step up.
Okay, so putting on our track shoes and getting in the race there. So we've got role of Europe slash Kim Jong-un's thinking in terms of promoting openness or communication, Mongolia, and joining in with Abe on a humanitarian initiative.
So let me start with this coalition of willing on humanitarian issue. I think that's a good idea. So the three countries, or along with the EU or Europe, can join us for this humanitarian front, pressing the North Korea to come up clean on this humanitarian issue, and also we can pose a questions of a human rights violation upon North Korea. So actually that's the area also we can bring that issue to all the international organizations as far as we can, also to raise the public awareness of this human rights violation and also human rights conditions in North Korea very much. I think this we have to form, not only just at the governmental level, but also non-governmental level, we have to form a coalition amongst us and also to put more pressure, and also actually that actually I hope I can bring some changes in China's policy to North Korea if we create another front on North Korea. That's one. About this Kim Jong-un's plot, why he's allowing this kinds of measure. Maybe he thinks maybe I can control the regime. 3 million cell phone, I can shut down that immediately. And also, ironically, just allowing people to enjoy the amusement park or like that, actually create kinds of buffer and cushion in the region, ironically. So nowadays, actually, for the past couple of years, North Korean economy has recorded positive growth. People in Pyongyang are better off than before. They are very relatively well-fed, not actually to the Western side, they're from their own side well-fed. So they are relatively satisfied with the Kim Jong-un regime, but the sustainability of the regime in doing so is quite questionable. So Kim Jong-un has created all his problem for the later stage. So if we cannot reverse that trend, so people will, if that's the case, people will oppose Kim Jong-un, but actually Kim Jong-un tries to deliver what people desperately wanted from him, so up to now. But it's questionable for him to continue to do so. So actually he has created his own dilemma for the future. Mongolia's role, there are various issues Mongolia can play. Of course, actually, President of Mongolia delivered a very clear message to Kim Jong-un, and also, of course, there are other issues. But actually, the South Korean government has put forward the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative to enhance the cooperation among the countries in the region. Mongolia is part of that, so maybe Mongolia can create some kinds of the ground for the countries to talk about this, the non-traditional security issues amongst us. That would be quite helpful to bring North Korea in the circle, in a more functional area, maybe this in a non-governmental level.
You know, on the Mongolian issue, I think, will Mongolia be able to play a central role in denuclearizing North Korea? Despite our hopes, I don't think that's really possible. But in a more serious vein, I think Mongolia is important for one central issue. After all, Mongolia was the world's second communist state after the Soviet Union, and the first to basically embrace market economies after the fall of communism. So in that sense, Mongolia has shown North Korea what you can do in terms of your political entity and your economic reforms. So in that sense, as a role model, I believe Mongolia is a testament to what the North Koreans could become in the next 5, 10 plus years. And this is perhaps one reason why the Mongolians are insisting that perhaps the other regional powers can play with Mongolia a much more constructive role in engaging North Korea. We have no problem with Mongolia engaging North Korea at all different levels. As you know, ever since the last 15 years, South Korea has had huge economic exchanges with Mongolia at the political level. So whatever Mongolia can do to move the talks down the road, we welcome that with open arms. Vis-a-vis what role does Europe play? I think Europe plays a very important role for one reason, and not just because it's a cash cow. Unfortunately, Europe doesn't have all that much money these days. The reason why it's important is because Europe, the EU in particular, is one of the pillars of diplomacy. If the EU does not play a central role in defusing tensions in Northeast Asia, it will have huge repercussions for you economically and politically. So in that sense, it is a key stakeholder. On what is Kim Jong-un up to? I think his GPS only goes within like 5 blocks of Pyongyang. And that's why, you know, he has all these Potemkin villages running around, but that's his mini GPS. What he really needs is a GPS for the outside world. And once he gives that to his citizens, it will be a very different North Korea. But that's what he's afraid of. He doesn't want a GPS that all citizens can share in North Korea today.
Yeah, I mean, I think on why, you know, cell phones and things are allowed, I mean, there's a couple reasons. You know, one, there's indications that the elites wanted them, either for their own needs to communicate or not. Two, you know, you have, you know, the people who are in the black markets, you know, they need cell phones. You have an infiltration already. And you have just whatever legitimate business North Korea is doing, you know, a need to communicate. So there's this practical need. And three, there was a report I saw that came out earlier that, you know, there is a belief, and it's probably to a large extent true, that basically every conversation is monitored. And if that's the case, you have a lot of censorship taking place. So, you know, there's always the risk that in a crisis, you know, people get to decide, I don't care if they're listening because I have to get information out. But then, as you know, Kang said, you know, you just shut the network down in that situation. So there's probably a sense that you can control this. You know, I think in the case of Europe, you know, an additional reason why Europe is, you know, a good partner for especially humanitarian outreach is that, you know, a lot of the European countries have embassies there. There's different European foundations based in Europe. They are perhaps well positioned to take and do more on this effort. Yeah, I think I'll just stop there.
Oh, well, let me answer Frank's question, which is I think very, very important. No, I don't think, Frank, that Koreans we don't see competing with Japan on who can be more humanitarian vis-a-vis North Korea. As I said, I think it's very important for us as Korean people to show our concerns to North Korean people that regardless of our political differences, we will give you assistance or aid on whether it's medical care, on nutrition, on economic reform, whatever it is that they need, we are more than willing to meet them halfway. And so, you know, as you know, there are some foundations that have played key roles in, teaching North Koreans how to open banks or whatever, and we'll do whatever we can to support those endeavors. And I think as long as the Japanese are able to move forward on the abductee issue, we have huge abductee issues with the North Koreans as well. Whether it's Korean prisoners of war that are still remaining in North Korea, or the fact that there are several hundred South Koreans who have been abducted over the last 50+ years. So those are all issues that are on the humanitarian table, Frank, and I don't think we want to overemphasize any one of them, but the most important are medical care and food. Those should be universal, and those should not be attached to political strings, as those are my personal views.
Right, and that's different than what's going on between Abe and North Korea, which is a very transactional issue, and in order for that to work, you have to have something to offer that North Korea wants, and then you have to go through a long process of building some kind of credibility. And I mean, you go back, this current initiative goes back over, you know, early in Abe's administration, with a visit to Pyongyang by his aide that blew up in their face, and then offline negotiations, and then maybe Yokota's daughter meeting with the grandparents in you know, in a third country, and all these steps. So it's no small undertaking, but we'll add that to the list of things to explore. We've run out of time today, but I want to thank all three of you again for coming today, and to Korea Economic Institute for working with us on this program and allowing us to take advantage of your great dialogue starting tomorrow. So
thank you for offering the venue and working with us on this.
And my thanks to everybody for coming today. Please join me in thanking our presenters.
Thank you. Troy?